Hello, 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 and welcome to yet another tale of Grillby's Grisly Tales. It is about 5 for those of you on the west coast, 7 for those of you in the central time zone, and 8 for those of you in the other time zones. Yeah, I guess that leaves Eastern for those in the States. I hope you are all doing well. Today's menu has the 3 strangers that we did not get to from before, the vampire, and a story from a little website called The Figure in Dark Robes. So, greetings, McPeples, 1, 2, 3, Molten, hello Carrot, hello Daniel, and hello Plushy. Alright, I highly suggest getting your cuddle buddies, your blankets, a warm cup of tea, something to settle in for the night, as these stories are bound to chill you almost as much as they do me. So, we shall begin with The 3 Strangers by Thomas Hardy. This one's a bit of a long one, so bear with me. Among the few features of agricultural England which retains an appearance but little modified by the lapses of centuries, may be reckoned the high, grassy, and furzy downs, combes, or ewe-leases, as they are indifferently called, that fill a large area of certain counties in the south and southwest. If any mark of human occupation is met with hereon, it usually takes the form of the solitary cottage, or some shepherd. 50 years ago, such a lonely cottage stood on such a down, and may possibly be standing there now. In spite of its loneliness, however, the spot, by actual measurement, was not more than 5 miles from a country town, yet that affected it little. 5 miles of irregular upland, during the long, inimical seasons, with their sleets, snows, rains, and mists, afford withdrawing space enough to isolate a Timon or a Nebuchadnezzar, much less, in fair weather, to please that less repellent tribe, the poets, philosophers, artists, and others who conceive and meditate of pleasant things. Some old earthen camp or barrow, some clump of trees, at least some starved fragment of ancient hedge is usually taken advantage of in the erection of these forlorn dwellings. But in the present case, such a kind of shelter had been disregarded. Oh. Did not know that. I don't know if we are or not. Pardon, back to the story it is. Let's see here. Higher Crowsters, as the house was called, stood quite detached and undefended. The only reason for its precise situation seemed to be the crossing of 2 footpaths at right angles, hard by, which may have crossed there, and thus for a good 500 years. Hence the house was exposed to the elements on all sides. But though the wind up here blew unmistakably when it did blow, and the rain hit hard whenever it fell, the various weathers of the winter season were not quite so formidable on the combe as they were imagined to be by dwellers on low ground. The raw rhymes were not so pernicious, as in the hollows, and the frosts were scarcely so severe. When the shepherd and his family who tenanted the house were pitied for their sufferings from the exposure. They said that upon the whole they were less inconvenienced by woozes and flames, or horses and flems, than when they lived by the stream of a snug neighbouring valley. The night of March 28th, 1829, was precisely one of the nights that were wont to call forth these expressions of commiseration. The level rainstorm smote walls, slopes, and hedges like the cloth-yard shafts of Senlac and Cressy. Such sheep and outdoor animals as had no shelter stood with their buttocks to the winds, while the trails of little birds trying to roost on some scraggly thorn were blown inside out like umbrellas. The gable end of the cottage was stained with wet, and the eaves droppings flapped against the wall, yet never was commiseration for the shepherd whom more misplaced, for that cheerful rustic was entertaining a large party in glorification of the christening of his second girl. The guests had arrived before the rain began to fall, and they were all now assembled in the chief or living room of the dwelling. A glance into the apartment at 8 o'clock on this eventful evening would have resulted in the opinion that it was as cozy and comfortable a nook as could be wished for in a boisterous weather. The calling of its inhabitant was proclaimed by a number of highly polished sheep crooks, without stems, that were hung ornamentally over the fireplace, the curl of each shining crook varying from the antiquated type engraved in the patriarchal pictures of old family Bibles, in the most approved fashion of the last local sheep fair. The room was lighted by half a dozen candles, having wicks only a trifle smaller than the grease which enveloped them. The candlesticks that were never used but at high days, holy days, and family feasts. The lights were scattered about the room, 2 of them standing on the chimney-piece. The position of candles was in itself significant. Candles on the chimney-piece always meant a party. On the hearth in front of the back brand, to give substance, blazed a fire of thorns that crackled like the laughter of the fool. 19 persons were gathered here. Of these, 5 women, wearing gowns of various bright hues, sat in chairs along the wall. Girls, shy and not shy, filled the window bench. 4 men, including Charlie Jake, the hedge carpenter, Elijah New, the parish clerk, and John Pitcher, a neighbouring dairyman, the shepherd's father-in-law, lolled in the settle. A young man and maid, who were blushing over tentative pourparlers on a life companionship, sat beneath the corner cupboard, and an elderly engaged man of 50 or upward moved restlessly about from spots where his betrothed was not to be spotted where she was. Enjoyment was pretty general, and so much the more prevailed in being unhampered by conventional restrictions. Absolute confidence in each other's good opinion begat perfect ease, while the finishing stroke of manner, amounting to a truly princely serenity, was lent to the majority of the absence of any expression or trait denoting that they wished to get on in the world, enlarge their minds, or do any eclipsing thing whatsoever, which nowadays so generally nips the bloom and bonhomie of all except the 2 extremes of the social scale. Shepherd Fennel had married well, his wife being a dairyman's daughter from a vale at a distance, who brought 50 guineas in her pocket, and kept them there, till they should be required for ministering to the needs of a coming family. This frugal woman had been somewhat exercised as to the character that should be given to the gathering. A sit-still party had its advantages, but an undisturbed position of ease in chairs and settles was apt to lead on the men to such an unconcessionable deal of topping that they would sometimes fairly drink the house dry. A dancing party was the alternative, but this, while avoiding the foregoing objection of the source of good drink, had a counterbalancing disadvantage in the matter of good victuals, the ravenous appetites endangered by the exercise causing immense havoc in the buttery. Shepherdess Fennel fell back upon the intermediate plan of mingling short dances with short periods of talk and singing, so as to hinder any ungovernable rage in either. But this scheme was entirely confined to her own gentle mind. The shepherd himself was in the mood to exhibit the most reckless phases of hospitality. The fiddler was a boy of those parts, about 12 years of age, who had a wonderful dexterity in jigs and reels, though his fingers were so small and short as to necessitate the constant shifting for the high notes, from which he scrambled back to the first position with sounds not of unmixed purity of tone. At 7 the shrill tweedledee of this youngster's hands had begun, accompanied by a booming ground bass from Elijah New, the parish clerk, who had thoughtfully brought with him his favourite musical instrument, the serpent. Dancing was instantaneous. Mrs. Fennel privately enjoyed the players, with no account to let the dance exceed the length of a quarter of an hour. But Elijah and the boy, in the excitement of the position, quite forgot the injunction. Moreover, Oliver Gales, a man of 17, one of the dancers, who was enamoured of his partner, a fair girl of 33 rolling years, had recklessly handed a new crown piece to the musicians as a bribe to keep going as long as they had muscle and wind. Mrs. Fennel, seeing the stream begin to generate on the countenances of her guests, crossed over, dodged the fiddler's bow, and put her hand on the serpent's mouth. But they took no notice, and fearing she might lose her character of genial hostess if she were to interfere too markedly, she retired and sat down helpless, and so the dance whizzed on with the cumulative fury, the performers moving in their planet-like courses, direct and retrograde, from apogee to perigee, till the hand of the well-kicked clock at the bottom of the room had travelled over the circumference of an hour. While these cheerful events were in course of enactment within Fennel's pastoral dwelling, an incident having considerable bearing on the party had occurred in the gloomy night without. Mrs. Fennel's concern about the growing fierceness of the dance corresponded in point of time with the ascent of a human figure to the solitary hill of the higher Crosters, from the direction of the distant town. This personage strode on through the rain without a pause, following the little worn path which further on in its course skirted the shepherd's cottage. It was nearly the time of full moon, and on this account, though the sky was lined with a uniform sheet of dripping cloud, ordinary objects out of doors were readily visible. The sad, wan light revealed the lonely pedestrian to be a man of supple frame. His gait suggested that he had somewhat passed the period of perfect and instinctive agility, though not so far as to be otherwise than rapid of motion when occasional required. At a rough guess, he might have been about 40 years of age. He appeared tall, but a recruiting sergeant, or other person accustomed to the judging of men's heights by the eye, would have discerned that this was chiefly owing to his gauntness, that he was not more than 5 feet 8 or 9. Notwithstanding the regularity of his tread, there was caution in it, as in that of one who mentally feels his way, and despite the fact that it was not a black coat nor a dark garment of any sort that he wore, there was something about him which suggested that he naturally belonged to the black-coated tribes of men. His clothes were of fustian and his boots hobnailed, yet in his progress he showed not the mud-accustomed bearing of a hobnailed and fustian peasantry. By the time that he had arrived abreast of the shepherd's premise, the rain came down, or rather came along, with yet more determined violence. The outskirts of the little settlement, settled partially, broke the force of the wind and rain. This induced him to stand still. The most salient of the shepherd's domestic erections was an empty sty at the forward corner of this hedgeless garden. For in these latitudes the principle of masking the homelier features of your establishment by a conventional frontage was unknown. The traveller's eye was attracted to this small building by the pallid shine of the wet slates that covered it. He turned aside, and finding it empty, stood under the pent roof for shelter. When he stood, the boom of the serpent within the adjacent house, and the lesser strains of the fiddle, reached the spot as an accompaniment to the surging hiss of the flying rain on the sod. Its louder beating on the cabbage leaves of the garden, on the 8 or 10 beehives just discernible by the path, and its dripping from the eaves into the row of buckets and pans that had been placed under the walls of the cottage. For at higher Crowstairs, as at all such elevated domiciles, the grand difficulty of housekeeping was an insufficiency of water, and a casual rainfall was utilized by turning out, as catchers, every utensil that the house contained. Some queer stories might be told of the contrivances for economy in suds and dishwashers that are absolutely necessitated in upland habitations during the droughts of summer. But at this season there were no such exigencies. A mere acceptance of what the skies bestowed was sufficient for the abundant store. At last the notes of the serpent ceased, and the house was silent. The cessation of activity aroused the solitary pedestrian from the reverie into which he had lapsed, and emerging from the shed with an apparently new intention, he walked up to the path to the house door. Arrived here, his first act was to kneel down on a large stone beside the row of vessels, and to drink a copious draught from one of them. Having quenched his thirst, he rose and lifted his hand to knock, but paused with his eye upon the panel. Since the dark surface of the wood revealed absolutely nothing, it was evident that he must be manually looking through the door, as if he wished to measure thereby all the possibilities that a house of this sort might include, and how they might bear upon the question of his entry. In his indecision, he turned and surveyed the sea around. Not a soul was anywhere visible. The garden path stretched downward from his feet, gleaming like a track of a snail to the roof of the little well, mostly dry, the well cover. The top rail of the garden gate were varnished with the same dull liquid glaze, while far away in the vale a faint whiteness of more than usual extent showed that the rivers were high in the meads. Beyond all this winked a few blurred lamplights through the beating drops, lights that denoted the situation of the country town from which he had appeared to come. The absence of all notes of life in that direction seemed to clinch his intentions. He knocked at the door. Within, a desultory chat had taken the place of movement and musical sound. The hedge carpenter was suggesting a song to the company, which nobody just then was inclined to undertake, so that the knock afforded a not unwelcome diversion. "Walk in," said the shepherd promptly. The latch clicked upward, and out of the night our pedestrian entered. The shepherd arose, snuffed 2 of the nearest candles, and turned to look at them. Their light disclosed that the stranger was dark in complexion, and not unprepossessing as to feature. His hat, which for a moment he did not remove, hung low over his eyes without concealing that they were large, open, and determined, moving with a flash rather than a glance round the room. He seemed pleased with the survey, and baring his shaggy head said, in a rich, deep voice, "The rain is so heavy, friends, that I ask leave to come in and rest a while." "To be sure, stranger," said the shepherd, "and faith you've been lucky to choose your timing, for we are having a bit of a fling for a glad cause, though to be sure a man could hardly wish that glad cause to happen more than once a year." "Nor less," spoke up a woman, "for it is best to get your family over and done with as soon as you can, so as to be all the earlier out of the faggot." "And what may this glad cause be?" asked the stranger. "A birth and christening," said the shepherd. The stranger hoped his host might not be made unhappy either by too many or too few of such episodes, and being invited by a gesture to pull at the mug, he readily acquiesced. His manner, which before entering had been so dubious, was now altogether that of a careless, candid man. "Late to be traipsing athwart this comb, says the engaged man of 50. "Late it is, master, as you say. I'll take a seat in the chimney corner, if you have nothing to urge against it, ma'am, for I am a little moist on the side that was next to the rain." Mrs. Shepherd Fennel assented, and made room for the self-invited comer, who, having got completely inside the chimney corner, stretched out his legs and his arms with the expansiveness of a person quite at home. "Yes, I am rather cracked in the vamp," he said freely, seeing that the eyes of the shepherd's wife fell upon his boots. "And I am not well fitted either. I have some rough times lately, and have been forced to pick up what I can get in the way of wearing, but I must find a suit better fit for working days when I reach home." "One of hereabouts?" she inquired. "Not quite that. Further up the country." "I thought so. And so be I, and by your tongue you come from my neighbourhood." "But you would hardly have heard of me," he said quickly. "My time would be long before yours, ma'am, you see." This testimony to the youthfulness of his hostess had the effect of stopping her cross-examination. "There is only one thing more wanted to make me happy," continued the newcomer, "and that is a little baccy, which I am sorry to say I'm out of." "Oh, fill your pipe," said the shepherd. "I must ask you to lend me a pipe likewise. A smoker and no pipe about ye?" "I have dropped it somewhere on the road." The shepherd filled and handed him a new clay pipe, saying as he did so, "Hand me your bucky box. I'll fill that too now that I'm about." The man went through the movement of searching his pockets. "Lost that too?" said his entertainer with some surprise. "I am afraid so," said the man with some confusion. Give it to me in a screw of paper." Lighting his pipe at the candle with the suction that drew the whole flame into the bowl, he resettled himself in the corner, and bent his looks up upon the faint stream from his damp legs, as if he wished to say no more. Meanwhile, the general body of guests had been taking little notice of this visitor by reason of an absorbing conversation, in which they were engaged with the band about a tune for the next dance. The matter being settled, they were about to stand up when an interruption came in the shape of another knock at the door. At sound of the same, the man in the chimney corner took up the poker and began stirring the brands as if doing it thoroughly were the one aim of his existence. And the second time the shepherd said, "Walk in." In a moment another man stood upon the straw-woven doormat. He too was a stranger. This individual was one of a type radically different from the first. There was more of the commonplace in his manner, and a certain jovial cosmopolitanism sat upon his features. He was several years older than the first arrival, his hair being slightly frosted, his eyebrows bristly, and his whiskers cut back from his cheeks. His face was rather full and flabby, and yet it was not altogether a face without power. A few grog blossoms marked the neighbourhood of his nose. He flung back his long drab greatcoat, revealing that beneath it he wore a suit of cinder-grey shade throughout, large heavy seals of some metal or other that would take a polish dangling from his fob as his only personal ornament. Shaking the water drops from his low-crowned glazed hat, he said, "I must ask for a few minutes' shelter, comrades, or I shall be wetted to my skin before I get to Casterbridge." "Make yourself at home, master," said the shepherd, perhaps a trifle less heartily than on the first occasion. Not that Fennel had the least tinge of niggardliness in his composition, but the room was far too large. Spare chairs were not numerous, and damp companions were not altogether desirable at close quarters for the women and girls in their brightened gowns. However, the second comer, after taking off his greatcoat and hanging his hat on a nail in one of the ceiling beams, as if he had been specially invited to put it there, advanced and sat down at the table. This had been pushed so closely to the chimney corner to give all available room to the dancers that its inner edge grazed the elbow of the man who had ensconced himself by the fire, and thus the two strangers were brought into close companionship. They nodded to each other by way of breaking the ice of unacquaintance, and the first stranger handed his neighbour the family mug, a huge vessel of brownware, having its upper edge worn away like a threshold by the rub of whole generations of thirsty lips that had gone the way of all flesh, and bearing the following inscriptions burnt upon its right-hand side in yellow letters: "There is no fun until I come." The other man, nothing loth, raised the mug to his lips, and drank on and on and on, till a curious blueness overspread the countenance of the shepherd's wife, who had regarded with no little surprise the first stranger's free offer to the second of what did not belong to him to dispense. "I knew it," said the topper of the shepherd, with much satisfaction. "When I walked up your garden before coming in, and saw the hives all of a row, I said to myself, where there's bees there's honey, and where there's honey there's mead. But mead of such a truly comfortable sort as this I really didn't expect to meet in my older days." He took yet another pull at the mug, till it assumed an ominous elevation. "Glad you enjoy it," the shepherd said warmly. "It is a goodish mead," assented Mrs. Fennel, with an absence of enthusiasm which seemed to say that it was possible to buy praise for one's cellar at too heavy a price. "It is trouble enough to make, and really I hardly think we shall make any more, for honey sells well, and we ourselves can shift with a drop of small mead and methalgin for common use from the comb washings." "Oh, but you'll never have the heart," reproachfully cried the stranger in cinder grey, after taking up the mug a third time and setting it down empty. "I love mead when 'tis old like this, as I love to go to church on Sundays, or to relive the needy any day of the week." "Ha!" the man in the chimney corner said, who, in spite of the taciturnity induced by the pipe of tobacco, could not or would not refrain from a slight testimony to his comrade's humour. Now the old mead of those days, brewed of the purest first year of or made in honey, 4 pounds to the gallon, with its due complement of white of eggs, cinnamon, ginger, clove, mace, rosemary, yeast, and processes of working, bottling, and cellaring, tasted remarkably strong, but it did not taste so strong as it actually was. Hence presently the stranger in cinder grey at the table, moved by its creeping influence, unbuttoned his waistcoat, threw himself back in his chair, spread his legs, and made his presence felt in various ways. "Well, well, as I say," he resumed, "I am going to Casterbridge, and to Casterbridge I must go. I should have been almost there by this time, but the rain drove me into your dwelling, and I am not sorry for it." "You don't live in Casterbridge," said the shepherd. "Not as yet, though I shortly mean to move there." "Going to set up in trade, perhaps?" "No, no," said the shepherd's wife. "It is easy to see that the gentleman is rich, and don't want to work at anything." The cinder grey stranger paused, as if to consider whether he would accept the definition of himself. He presently rejected it by answering, "Rich is not quite the word for me, dame. I do work, and I must work, and even if I only get to Casterbridge by midnight, I must begin work there at 8 tomorrow morning. Yes, het or wet, blow or snow, famine or sword, my day's work tomorrow must be done." "Poor man, then in spite of seeming you be worse off than we," replied the shepherd's wife. "'Tis the nature of my trade, men and maidens, 'tis the nature of my trade more than my poverty, but really and truly I must up and off, or I shan't get a lodging in the town." However, the speaker did not move, and directly added, "There's time for one more draught of friendship before I go, and I'd perform it at once if the mug were not dry." "Here's a mug of small," said Mrs. Fennel. "Small we call it, though to be sure 'tis only the first wash of the combs." "No," said the stranger disdainfully, "I won't spoil your first kindness by partaking of your second." "Certainly not," broke in Fennel. "We do not increase and multiply every day. Now fill the mug again." He went away to the dark place under the stairs where the barrel stood. The shepherdess followed him. "Why should you do this?" she said reproachfully as soon as they were alone. "He's emptied it once, though it held enough for 10 people, and now he's not contented with the small, but must needs call for more of the strong, and the stranger unbeknown to any of us. For my part, I don't like the look of the man at all." "But he's in the house, my honey, and 'tis a wet night, and a christening. Dazed what's a cup of mead more or less. There'll be plenty more next bee burning." "Very well, this time then," she answered, looking wistfully at the barrel. "But what is the man's calling? Where is he one of, that he should come in and join us like this?" "I don't know. I'll ask him again." The catastrophe of having the mug drained dry at one pull by the stranger in cinder grey was effectually guarded against this time by Mrs. Fennel. She poured out his allowance in a small cup, keeping the large one at a discreet distance from him. When he had tossed off his portion, the shepherd renewed his inquiry about the stranger's occupation. The latter did not immediately reply, and the man in the chimney corner with sudden demonstrativeness said, "Anybody may know my trade. I'm a wheelwright." "A very good trade for these parts," said the shepherd, "and anyone may know mine, if they've the sense to find it out," said the stranger in cinder grey. "You may generally tell what a man is by his claws," observed the hedge carpenter, looking at his own hands. "My fingers be as full of thorns as an old pincushion is of pins." The hands of the man in the chimney corner instinctively sought the shade, and he gazed into the fire as he resumed his pipe. The man at the table took up the hedge carpenter's remark, and added smartly, "True, but the oddity of my trade is that, instead of setting a mark upon me, it sets a mark upon my customers." No observation being offered by anyone in elucidation of this enigma, the shepherd's wife once more called for a song. The same obstacles presented themselves as at the former time. One had no voice, another had forgotten the first verse. The stranger at the table, whose soul had now risen to a good working temperature, relieved the difficulty by exclaiming that to start the company he would sing himself. Thrusting one thumb into the arm of his waistcoat, he waved the other hand in the air, and with an extemporizing gaze at the shining sheep crooks above the mantelpiece began, "Oh, my trade it is the rarest one, simple shepherds all, my trade is a sight to see, for my customers I tie, and take them up on high, and waft them to the far country." The room was silent when he had finished the verse, with one exception, that of the man in the chimney corner, who at the singer's word, "Chorus," joined him in a deep bass voice of musical relish, "and waft 'em to a far country." Oliver Gales, John Pitcher the dairyman, the parish clerk, the engaged man of 50, the row of young women against the wall, seemed lost in thought not of the gayest kind. The shepherd looked meditatively to the ground. The shepherdess gazed keenly at the singer, and with some suspicion she was doubting whether this stranger were merely singing an old song from recollection, or was composing one there and then for the occasion. All were as perplexed at the obscure revelation as the guests at Belshazzar's feast. Apologies, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Hello to everyone who just came in. As the guests at Belshazzar's feast, except the man in the chimney corner, who quietly said, "Second verse, stranger," and smoked on. The singer thoroughly moistened himself from his lips inwards, and went on with the next stanza as requested. "My tools are but common ones, simple shepherds all. My tools are no sight to see. A little hempen string, and a post whereon to swing, are implements enough for me." The shepherd Fennel glanced around. There was no longer any doubt that the stranger was answering his question rhythmically. The guests, one and all, started back with suppressed exclamations. The young women engaged to the man of 50 fainted half away, and would have proceeded, but finding him wanting in alacrity for catching her, she sat down trembling. "Oh, he's there," whispered the people in the background, mentioning the name of an ominous public officer. "He's come to do it. 'Tis to be at Casterbridge jail tomorrow, the man for sheep stealing, the poor clockmaker we heard of, who used to live away at Shottsford and had no work to do. Timothy Summers, whose family were starving, and so he went out to Shottsford by the night road, and took a sheep in the open daylight to find the farmer and the farmer's wife and the farmer's lad, and every man Jack among 'em. He," and they nodded towards the stranger of the deadly trade, "is come from up the country to do it, because there's not enough to do it in his home country town. And he's got the place here now. Our own county man's dead. He's going to live in the same cottage, under the prison wall." The stranger in cinder grey took no notice of the whispered string of observations, but again wetted his lips. Seeing that his friend in the chimney corner was the only one who reciprocated his jovialty in any way, he held out his cup towards the appreciative comrade, who also held his own. They clinked together, the eyes of the rest of the room hanging upon the singer's actions. He parted his lips for the third verse, but at that moment another knock was audible upon the door. This time the knock was faint, hesitating. The company seemed scared. The shepherd looked with consternation toward the entrance, and it was with some effort that he resisted his alarm's life depreciatory glance, and uttered for the third time the welcoming words, "Walk in." The door was gently opened, and another man stood upon the mat. He, like those who had preceded him, was a stranger. This time it was a short, small personage, of fair complexion, and dressed in a decent suit of dark clothes. "Can you tell me the way to?" he began, when gazing round the room to observe the nature of the company amongst whom he had fallen. His eyes lighted on the stranger in cinder grey. It was just at that instant when the latter, whom had thrown his mind into a song with such a will that he scarcely heeded the interruption, silenced all whispers and inquiries by bursting into his third verse. Tomorrow is my working day, simple shepherds all. Tomorrow is a working day for me, for the farmer's sheep is slain, and the lad who did it taken, and on his soul may God have mercy. The stranger in the chimney corner, waving cups with the singer so heartily that his mead sloshed out on the hearth, repeated in his bass voice as before, and on his soul may God have mercy. All this time the third stranger had been standing in the doorway. Finding out that he did not come forward or go on speaking, the guests particularly regarded him. They noticed, to their surprise, that he stood before them the picture of abject terror, his knees trembling, his hands shaking so violently that the door latch by which he supported himself rattled audibly. His white lips were parted, his eyes fixed on the merry officer of justice in the middle of the room. A moment more, and he had turned, closed the door, and fled. "What a man can it be?" said the shepherd. The rest, between the awfulness of their late discovery and the odd conduct of this third visitor, looked as if they knew not what to think, and said nothing. Instinctively they withdrew further and further from the grim gentleman in the midst, whom some of them seemed to take for the Prince of Darkness himself, till they formed a remote circle, an empty space of floor being left between them and him. Circulus cujus centrum diabolus. The room was so silent, though there were more than 20 people in it, that nothing could be heard but the patter of the rain against the window shutters, accompanied by the occasional hiss of a stray drop that fell down the chimney into the fire, and the steady puffing of the man in the corner, who had now resumed his pipe of long clay. The stillness was unexpectedly broken. The distant sound of a gun reverberated through the air, apparently from the direction of the country town. "Be jiggered!" cried the stranger who had sung the song, jumping up. "What does that mean?" asked several. "A prisoner has escaped from the jail, that's what it means." All listened. The sound was repeated. None of them spoke, but the man in the chimney corner, who said quietly, "I've often been told that in this county they fire a gun at such times, but I've never heard it till now." "I wonder if it is my man," murmured the personage in the grey suit. "Surely it is," said the shepherd involuntarily, "and surely we've zeed him, that little man who looked in at the door by now, and quivered like a leaf when he zeed ye, and heard your song. His teeth chattered, and the breath went out of his body," said the dairyman. "And his heart seemed to sink within him like a stone," said Oliver Gales. "And he bolted as if he had been shot at," said the hedge carpenter. "True, his teeth chattered, and his heart seemed to sink, and he bolted as if he'd been shot at," slowly summed up the man in the chimney corner. "I didn't notice it," remarked the hangman. "We were all a-wondering what made him run off in such a fright," faltered one of the women against the wall, "and now 'tis explained. The firing of the alarm gun went off in intervals, low and sullenly, and the suspicions became a certainty. The sinister gentleman in the grey cinder grey roused himself. Is there a constable here?" he asked in thick tones. "If so, let him step forward." The engaged man of 50 stepped quavering out from the wall, his betrothed beginning to sob at the back of the chair. "Are you a sworn constable?" "I be, sir." "Then pursue the criminal at once with assistance, and bring him back here. He can't have gone far." "I will, sir, I will. When I've got my staff, I'll go home, get it, come sharp here, and start in a body. Staff? Never mind your staff, the man'll be gone." "But I can't do nothing without my staff, can I? William and John and Charles Jake." "No, for there's the king's royal crown a-painted on in yaller and gold, and the lion and the unicorn, so as when I raisen up and hit my prisoner, 'tis made a lawful blow thereby. I wouldn't tempt to take up a man without my staff. No, not if I hadn't the law to to give me courage, why instead of my taking up him, he might take me up. Now I'm a king's man myself, and I can give you authority enough for this, said the formidable officer in grey. Now then, all ye be ready. Have ye any lanterns? Yes, have ye any lanterns? I demand it, said the constable. And the rest of you able-bodied men, yes, the rest of ye, said the constable. Have you some good stout staves and pitchforks in the name of the law, and take 'em in your hands, and go in quest, and do as we in authority tell ye. Thus aroused, the men prepared to give chase. The evidence was indeed, though circumstantial, so convincing that but little argument was needed to show the shepherd's guests that after what they had seen, it would look very much like connivance if they did not instantly pursue the unhappy third stranger, who could not as yet have gone more than a few 100 yards over such an uneven country. A shepherd is always well provided with lanterns, and lighting these hastily and with hurdled staves in their hands, they pulled out of the door, taking a direction along the crest of the hill, away from the town, the rain having fortunately a little abated. Disturbed by the noise, or possibly by unpleasant dreams of a baptism, the child who had been christened began to cry heartbrokenly in the room overhead. These notes of grief came down through the chinks of the floor to the ears of the women below, who jumped up one by one and seemed glad of the excuse to ascend and comfort the baby, for the incidents of the last half-hour greatly oppressed them. Thus, in the space of 2 or 3 minutes, the room of the ground floor was deserted quite. But 'twas not for long. Hardly had the sound of footsteps died away when a man returned round the corner of the house from the direction the pursuers had taken. Peeping in at the door and seeing nobody there, he entered leisurely. It was a stranger from the chimney-corner, who had gone out with the rest. The motive of his return was shown by his helping himself to a cut piece of skimmer cake that lay on a ledge beside where he had sat, and which he had apparently forgot to take with him. He had poured out half the cup more mead from the quantity that remained, ravenously eating and drinking these as he stood. He had not finished when another figure came in just as quietly, his friend in cinder grey. "Oh, you here?" said the latter, smiling. "Thought you had gone to help in the capture." And the speaker also revealed the object of his return by looking solicitously around for the fascinating mug of old mead. "And I thought you had gone," said the other, continuing his skimmer cake with some effort. "Well, in second thoughts, I felt there were more than enough without me," said the first confidently. "And such a night as it is, too. Besides, it is the business of the government to take care of its criminals, not mine. True, so it is, and I felt as you did that there were enough without me. I don't want to break my limbs running over the humps and hollows of the wild country, nor I neither, between you and me. These shepherd people are used to it, simple-minded souls, you know, stirred up to anything in a moment. They'll have him ready for me before the morning, and no trouble to me at all. They'll have him, and we shall have saved ourselves all labour in the matter. True. Well, my way is to Casterbridge, and 'tis as much as my legs will do to take me that far. Going the same way? No, I am sorry to say I have to get home over there." He nodded indefinitely to the right. "And I feel as you do that it is quite enough for my legs to do before bedtime." The other had by this time finished the mead in the mug, after which, shaking his hands heartily at the door, and wishing each other well, they went their separate ways. In the meantime, the company of pursuers had reached the end of the Hog's Back elevation, which dominated this part of the down. They decided at no particular plan of action, and finding that the man of the baleful trade was no longer in the company, they seemed quite unable to form any such plan now. They descended in all directions down the hill, and straightway several of the party fell into the snares set by nature for all misguided midnight ramblers over this part of the Cretaceous formation. The lanchets, or flint slopes, which belted the escarpment at intervals of a dozen yards, took the less cautious ones unaware, and losing their footing on the rubbly steep, they slid sharply downwards. The lanterns rolling from their hands to the bottom were there laying on their sides till the horn was scorched through. When they had again gathered themselves together, the shepherd, as the men who knew the country best, took the lead, and guided them around these treacherous inclines. The lanterns, which seemed rather to dazzle their eyes and warn the fugitive than to assist them in the explanation, were extinguished. Due silence was observed, and in this more rational order they plunged into the vale. It was a grassy, briary, moist defile, affording some shelter to any person who had sought it, but the party perambulated it in vain, and ascended on the other side. Here they wandered apart, and after an interval closed together again to report progress. At the second time of closing in they found themselves near a lonely ash, the single tree on this part of the combe, probably sown there by a passing bird some 50 years before. And here, standing a little to one side of the trunk, as motionless as the trunk itself, appeared the man they were in quest of, his outline being well defined against the sky beyond. The band noiselessly drew upon him, and faced him. "Your money or your life," said the constable sternly to the still figure. "No, no," whispered John Pitcher. "'Tisn't our side ought to say that. That's the doctrine of the vagabonds like him, and we be on the side of the law." "Well, well," said the constable impatiently, "I must say something, mustn't I? And if you had all the weight of this undertaking upon your mind, perhaps you'd say the wrong thing too. Prisoner at the bar, surrender in the name of the Father of the Crown, I main." The man under the tree seemed now to notice them for the first time, and giving them no opportunity whatever for exhibiting the courage, he strolled slowly towards them. He was indeed the little man, the third stranger, but his trepidation had in great measure gone. "Well, travellers," he said, "did I hear ye speak to me?" "You did. You've got to come and be our prisoner at once," said the constable. "We arrest ye on the charge of not biding in Casterbridge jail in a decent, proper manner to be hung tomorrow morning. Neighbours, do your duty. Seize the culprit." On hearing the charge, the man seemed enlightened, and, saying not another word, resigned himself with the preternatural civility to the search party, who, with their staves in their hands, surrounded him all at once and marched him back towards the shepherd's cottage. It was 11 o'clock by the time they arrived. The light shining from the open door, a sound of men's voices within, proclaimed to them, as they approached the house, that some new events had arisen in their absence. On entering, they discovered the shepherd's living room to be invaded by 2 officers from Casterbridge jail, and a well-known magistrate who lived at the nearest country seat, intelligence of the escape having become generally circulated. "Gentlemen," said the constable, "I have brought back your man, not without risk and danger, but every one must do his duty. He is inside the circle of able-bodied persons who have lent me useful aid, and considering the ignorance of crown work, men, bring forward your prisoner." And the third stranger was led to the light. "Who is this?" said one of the officials. "The man," said the constable. "Certainly not," said the turnkey, and the first corroborated his statement. "But how can it be otherwise?" said the constable. "Or why was he so terrified at sight of the singing instrument of the law who sat there?" Here he related the strange behaviour of the third stranger on entering the house during the hangman's song. "Can't understand it," said the officer coolly. "All I know is that this is not the condemned man. He's a quite different character from this one, a gauntish fellow with dark hair and eyes, rather good-looking, and with a musical bass voice that if you heard it once you'd never mistake as long as you lived." "Why, souls, 'twas the man in the chimney corner!" "Eh, what?" said the magistrate, coming forward after inquiring particulars from the shepherd in the background. "Haven't you got the man after all?" "Well, sir," said the constable, "he's the man we were in search of. That's true, and yet he's not the man we were in search of, for the man we were in search of was not the man we wanted, sir, if you understand my everyday way, for 'twas the man in the chimney corner." "A pretty kettle of fish altogether," said the magistrate. "You had better start for the other man at once." The prisoner now spoke for the first time. The mention of the man in the chimney corner seemed to have moved him as nothing else could. "Sir," he said, stepping forward to the magistrate, "take no more trouble about me. The time has come when I may as well speak. I have done nothing. My crime is that the condemned man is my brother. Early this afternoon I left home at Shropsford to tramp it all the way to Casterbridge jail to bid him farewell. I was benighted, and called here to rest and ask the way. When I opened the door I saw before me the very man, my brother, that I thought to see in the condemned cell at Casterbridge. He was in his chimney corner, and jammed close to him, so that he could not have got out if he had tried, was the executioner who'd come to take his life, singing a song about it, and not knowing that it was his victim, who was close by, joining in to save appearances. My brother looked a glance of agony at me, and I knew he meant, 'Don't reveal what you see, my life depends upon it.' I was so terror-struck that I could hardly stand, and not knowing what I did, I turned and hurried away." The narrator's manner and tone had the stamp of truth, and his story made great impression on all around. "And do you know where your brother is at present time?" asked the magistrate. "I do not. I have never seen him since I closed this door." "I can testify to that, for we've been between ye ever since," said the constable. Where does he think to fly to? What is his occupation? He is a watch and clockmaker, sir. He said he was a wheelwright, a wicked rogue, said the constable. The wheels of clocks and watches he meant, no doubt, said the shepherd Fennel. I thought his hands were palish for trade. Well, it appears to me that nothing can be gained by retaining this poor man in custody, said the magistrate. Your business lies with the other, unquestionably. And so the little man was released off-hand, but he looked nothing the less sad on that account, it being beyond the power of magistrate constable to raise out the written troubles in his brains, for they concerned another whom he regarded with more solicitude than himself. When this was done, and the man was gone his way, the night was found to be so far advanced that it was deemed useless to renew the search before the next morning. Next day, accordingly, the quest for the clever sheep-stealer became general and keen, to all appearance at least, but the intended punishment was cruelly disproportionated to the transgression, and the sympathy of a great many country folk in that district was strongly on the side of the fugitive. Moreover, his marvellous coolness and daring in hob-and-nobbing with the hangman under the unprecedented circumstances of the shepherd's party won their admiration, so that it may be questioned if all those who ostensibly made themselves so busy in exploring the wooden fields and lanes were quite so thorough when it came to the private examination of their own lofts and outhouses. Stories were afloat of a mysterious figure being occasionally seen in some old overgrown trackway or other, remote from turnpike roads, but when a search was instituted in any of those suspected quarters, nobody was found. Thus the days, weeks passed without tidings. In brief, the bass-voiced man of the chimney-corner was never recaptured. Some said that he went across the sea. Others that he did not, but buried himself in the depths of populations. At any rate, the gentleman in cinder grey never did his morning's work at Casterbridge, or met anywhere at all, for business purposes, the genial comrade with whom he had passed an hour of relaxation in this lonely house on the combe. The grass has long been green on the graves of Shepherd Fennel and his frugal wife. The guests who made up the christening party have mainly followed their entertainers to the tomb. The baby in whose honour they all had met is a matron in the sere and yellow leaf, and the arrival of the three strangers at the shepherd's that night, and the details connected therewith, is a story as well known as ever in the country about Higher Crowstairs. That ends the rather long-winded tale. Not so much creepy as it is rather odd and long-winded, I'll admit. As for everyone, hello to those who are newly in, and so long and have a great rest. For those who were not able to stay, this shall be uploaded later. I believe there was a question asked earlier. Here. We'll try the Dusthill gameplay. I'll have to see what Sans and Papyrus and Blue are up to, but we shall probably try. We shall try. As for which AU is scary, I would have to say Dusthill, just because it doesn't really have a rhyme or reason for such things to have happened. Horrortale and Axetale each have their own reasons for it, if that answers the question sufficiently. Now then, on to the next story. The Vampire by Jan Neruda. The excursion steamer brought us from Constantinople to the shore of the island of Principe, and we disembarked. The number of passengers were not large. There was one Polish family, a father, mother, daughter, and her bridegroom. And then we two. Oh yes, I must not forget that when we were already on the wooden bridge, which crosses the Golden Horn to Constantinople, a Greek, a rather youthful man, joined us. He was probably an artist, judging by the portfolio he carried under his arm. Long black locks floated to his shoulders. His face was pale. His eyes were black and deeply set in their sockets. From the first moment he interested me, especially for his obligingness. Take two. obligingness for his knowledge of local conditions. But he talked too much, and I turned away from him. All the more agreeable with the Polish family. The father and mother were a good-natured fine folk, the lover of a husband, handsome young fellow, of direct and refined manners. They had come to Principo to spend the summer months, for the sake of the daughter, who was slightly ailing. The beautiful pale girl was either just recovering from a severe illness, or else a serious disease was just fastening its hold upon her. She leaned upon her lover when she walked, and very often sat down to rest, while a frequent dry little cough interrupted her whispers. Whenever she coughed, her escort would considerately pause in their walk. He always cast upon her a glance of sympathetic suffering, and she would look back at him as if she would say, "It is nothing, I am happy." They believed in health and happiness. On the recommendation of the Greek, who departed from us immediately at the pier, the family secured quarters in the hotel on the hill. The hotel keeper was a Frenchman, and his entire building was equipped comfortably and artistically, according to the French style. We breakfasted together, and when the noon heat had abated somewhat, we all betook ourselves to the heights, where in the grove of Siberian stone pines we could refresh ourselves with the view. Hardly had we found a suitable spot and settled ourselves when the Greek appeared again. He greeted us lightly, looked about, and seated himself only a few steps from us. He opened his portfolio and began to sketch. "I think he purposely sits with his back to the rocks so that we can't look at his sketch," I said. "We don't have to," said the young Pole. "We have enough before us to look at." After a while he added, "It seems to me he's sketching us in a sort of background. We'll let him." We truly did have enough to gaze at. There is not a more beautiful or more happy corner in the world than that very Principo. The political martyr Irene, the contemporary of Charles the Great, lived there for a month as an exile. If I could live a month of my life there, I would be happy for the memory of it for the rest of my days. I shall never forget even that one day spent at Principo. The air was clear as a diamond, so soft, so caressing, that one's whole soul swung out upon it into the distance. At the right beyond the sea projected the brown Asiatic summits, one of the 9 islands of the Prince's archipelago. Rose with the cypress forest into the peaceful heights like a sorrowful dream, crowned by a great structure, an asylum for those whose minds were sick. I believe it was the neighbouring island, Chalky. The Sea of Marmora was but lightly ruffled, and played in all colours like a sparkling opal. In the distance the sea was as white as milk, then rosy between the 2 islands, a glowing orange, and below us it was beautifully greenish-blue, like a transparent sapphire. It was resplendent in its own beauty. Nowhere were there any large ships, only small craft, flying the English flag, sped along the shore. One was a steamboat, as big as a watchman's booth. The second had about 12 oarsmen, and when their oars rose simultaneously, molten silver dripped from them. Trustful dolphins darted in and out among them, and dove with long arcing flights above the surface of the water. Through the blue heavens now and then calm eagles winged their way, measuring the space between 2 continents. The entire slope below us was covered with blossoming roses, whose fragrance filled the air. From the coffee house near the sea music was carried up to us through the clear air, hushed somewhat by the distance. The effect was enchanting. We all sat silent and steeped our souls completely in the picture of paradise. The young Polish girl lay on the grass with her head supported on the bosom of her lover. The pale oval of her delicate face was slightly tinged with soft colour, and from her blue eyes tears suddenly gushed forth. The lover understood, bent down and kissed each tear away. Her mother also was moved to tears, and even I, felt a strange twinge. "Here mind and body both must get well," whispered the girl. "How happy a land this is! God knows I haven't any enemies, but if I had, I would forgive them here," said the father in a trembling voice, and again we became silent. We were all in such a wonderful mood. So unspeakably sweet it was. Each felt for himself a whole world of happiness. Each one would have shared his happiness with the whole world. All felt the same, and so no one disturbed another. We had scarcely even noticed the Greek. After an hour or so had risen, folded his portfolio, with a slight nod, had taken his departure. We remained. Finally, after several hours, when the distance was becoming overspread with a darker violet, so magically beautiful in the south, the mother reminded us it was time to depart. We rose and walked downstairs towards the hotel, with the easy, elastic steps that characterized carefree children. We sat down in the hotel under the handsome veranda. Hardly had we been seated when we heard below the sounds of quarrelling and oaths. Our Greek was wrangling the hotel keeper, and for entertainment of it we listened. The amusement did not last long. "If I didn't have other guests," growled the hotel keeper, and ascended the steps towards us. "I beg you to tell me, sir," asked the Pole of the approaching hotel keeper, "who is that gentleman? What's his name?" Who knows what the fellow's name is?" grumbled the hotel keeper, and he gazed venomously downward. "We call him the Vampire." "An artist? Fine trade. He sketches only corpses. Just as soon as someone in Constantinople or here in the neighbourhood dies, that very day he has a picture of the dead one completed. The fellow paints them beforehand. He never makes a mistake, just like a vulture." The old Polish woman shrieked affrightedly. In her arms lay her daughter, pale as chalk. She had fainted. In one bound the lover had leapt down the steps. With one hand he seized the Greek, and the other reached for the portfolio. We ran down after him. Both men were rolling in the sand. The contents of the portfolio were scattered all about. On one sheet, sketched with a crayon, was the head of the young Polish girl, her eyes closed, and a wreath of myrtle upon her brow. And thus ends the story of the vampire. Not nearly as Dracula-filled as I was expecting, but still creepy nonetheless. Imagine you artists out there having that talent of knowing when someone would die in an age before photographs, and being able to draw them precisely the day or week prior to their death to commemorate them. It's an interesting idea, no? And finally, we have a final story, the figure in dark robes. This is taken from the Occult Museum website. The author is Ken Miyamoto. I was a freshman in high school in my hometown of La Crosse, Wisconsin. I was sleeping over at my friend Tom's house. We were watching a movie in his living room when he suddenly got a phone call. I watched as he listened to what was being said on the other line. I watched an emotion pour over his face as he threw the phone across the room. After moments of crying, he told me that a boy at my school had committed suicide. Now, I knew this boy only through seeing him in the halls. My friend Tom and I didn't go to the same high school, but Tom had gone to middle school with this boy. Apparently, Tom bullied him during those years. He wasn't proud of it, and to be honest, I was pretty surprised, because he was a great guy. He had utter remorse. We decided to sneak out and go for a walk. The year was roughly 1990, maybe 91. We were freshmen in high school. Now sneaking out was nothing new. We always did it. At the time, we weren't into drugs or alcohol or partying. We just liked the freedom of walking the streets at night. The discussions were always great. Normally we'd go walk through the big cemetery that was near my house. It was behind the train tracks that still run through La Crosse to this day. We loved the danger of the cemetery. The scares. We were kids. It was the rite of passage. As we walked along the train tracks leading to the cemetery, we stopped. To this day, I can't explain why. We had walked into that cemetery dozens of times, and on scarier nights. For whatever reason, we didn't want to go in there. I don't know if the thought of death on our minds due to our classmate's suicide was a factor. Perhaps. Regardless, without really saying anything to each other, we stopped, turned round, and decided to head down to a nearby street. Now, in retrospect, I do have to say that throughout this walk, things seemed off. There wasn't a car in sight. This was suburbia. Even walking through the town's main street was odd, because there just weren't any cars. Odd. It was roughly around midnight. It was a weekend night. Where was everybody? Perhaps just a strange coincidence. Lastly, there was something in the air. Both Tom and I felt it. We even brought it up. It feels weird tonight. The air, the lights. So we decided to walk down a dead-end street. At the end of the street was a ditch with a simple up, down and up trail that led to the street that I lived on. Simple enough. Keep in mind, as I get into the horrifying part of this story, that we were in the suburbs. These weren't old creepy houses with strange individuals. The trees were small. It wasn't a brand new development, but it wasn't that old either. So as Tom and I are walking down this street, we're looking down to the road beneath our feet as we talk. I don't remember the exact conversation at this particular moment. Perhaps we were talking about the tragedy of that night. But it could just have easily been about Star Wars or Akira. As we approached the dead end, which was a few houses away, Tom and I suddenly stopped. We did so at the same time, without saying a single word to each other. Our heads turned slowly towards each other, both sensing something. The hair on our arms and the back of our necks stood up high. Then our gaze slowly moved forward, in unison, slightly to the right. That's when we saw it. About 2 houses away, in a virtually barren front yard of a suburban home, beside some bushes, was a very dark figure. It was someone or something in dark robes. No face, no features at all. Just the robe. Now this figure didn't acknowledge us. Not yet. It instead walked or moved in a certain way. I can't quite articulate it correctly. As if it were walking in circles, slowly, without ever really walking. It held something that was blowing in the wind. Yes, the wind picked up a little bit as well. Another odd element was that the light that illuminated it somewhat. There was a street light a few houses up, but it was not strong enough to illuminate this figure as it was. Tom and I were frozen. In fact, I'm almost frozen as I write this. It's been a while since I have thought about this night, so there we stood, frozen in fear, staring at this figure moving, yet doing so without moving. And it was holding something, or perhaps what was blowing in the wind was more of its robe, I'm not sure. We stared at this thing for I don't know how long, until it stopped and looked up at us suddenly as finally alarmed by a presence. Oh, that was enough for us. We ran away as fast as we could. We got through a side street that was to lead us up to a parallel street towards my neighbourhood. The street led to a slight hill as we rounded the corner and started running up the hill in a panic. We stopped because on top of that hill we saw another dark figure with its arms raised. We turned around and ran in the direction of Tom's house, which at this distance was at least 5 miles away. We ran. Time stood still. The next thing I remember, we were lying in the middle of a courtyard of some other neighbourhood that we'd never been in, gasping for breath. We sat up, and without saying a word, we walked in silence back to his house. The air felt normal again. Although we felt like we were in a haze of sorts, albeit out of danger. We fell asleep in his house. I woke up that morning and went home. A few days later, I rode my bike to the location. Perhaps it was just shadow play. Perhaps there was a certain tree or bush or maybe a for sale sign or something that made it look like there was something else there. Perhaps an old Halloween decoration that was left out. Who knows? Nothing. It was a wide, open yard with nothing in it. Tom and I didn't speak of that night for a long time. Years later, when I brought it up, he replied, "Yeah. What the hell was that?" As if no time had passed. What was it? I have no idea. We hadn't taken any drugs. We hadn't been drinking or any alcohol. I wonder if it had been a haunting, a spectre, a ghost, something, maybe the Reaper himself. Maybe it was an alien abduction or sighting. We saw no craft, but there was that unexplained light. Or maybe it was some other kids messing with us. But how would they know we were coming? How could they be so prepared? I just don't know. That was roughly 24 years ago, give or take. And yes, the story is true. Sadly, my best friend Tom passed away suddenly a few months ago. I thought of this night during his funeral. I thought of returning to that site. I thought of the odd coincidence of unexpected and surprising death, just like my classmate that night. Is there a connection? Were we seeing some future fate for one of us, which sadly fell upon my best friend Tom? Was this all some sort of dual hallucination? In my mind, anyway. I don't know. But I'll tell you one thing. That creature still haunts my nightmares.